Ever squirm at the sight of bugs crawling across the floor? Or maybe this makes your stomach turn.
In today's episode of the Enriched Mindset Podcast, we're diving into the psychology of disgust and how it connects to politics and morality with none other than Dr. Yoel Inbar.
He's a brilliant professor and director of the Morality, Affect, and Politics Lab at the University of Toronto. He's also the co-host of Two Psychologists, 4 Beers, and has been cited in over 10,000 academic papers.
So, how does something as primal as disgust tie into your deepest beliefs?
I'm Dr. Lee.
And I'm Olivia.
And welcome to the Enriched Mindset Podcast. Today we have Dr. Yoel Inbar coming from the University of Toronto. Dr. Inbar, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Where are you joining us from today?
Well, this is my home office that you see on camera here. This is where I work probably about half the time.
Oh, awesome.
Nice.
Okay. Well, at the Enriched Mindset Podcast, we usually start off these podcasts with a bit of a dad joke. All right, Liv, why don't you go ahead?
All right. What do you call a sad coffee?
What?
A depresso.
Okay. All right. Here's another one. How do you get a psych major off your front porch?
Okay, how?
Pay for the pizza already and leave a generous tip. Okay. All right.
That one's
I don't know
kind of
about
harsh.
All right. Well, you have a podcast. It's called Two Psychologists and 4 Beers.
Here we do it a little differently. 2 psychologists, 1 psych student, and 3 matchas.
3 matchas.
Oh, nice. You guys
Nice.
do
All
it.
right, let's try this out.
All right, cheers.
Cheers.
Good.
Nice.
Are you a matcha drinker?
On occasion. Actually, the beer theme for the podcast, I came up with this years ago when I could still tolerate hangovers a little better. And at this point, it's like 2 beers and the next day I feel bad. So I feel like maybe I ought to rework the theme to be tea focused. Maybe it certainly would be better for my health.
So you usually go through 2 beers?
I try to. Yeah.
Oh.
I try to.
Nice. Maybe
Yeah. I
next
try to
week
stick to
try
it.
Matcha beer.
Yeah. Ooh.
I don't know.
Okay. All right. We'll just get right into it with some questions. Liv, you can start.
Yeah, I'll start. So I often feel this way when I want to approach a professor or make a connection with them, but often students feel really intimidated about them. Almost feels like they're not like real people. So what's something you can tell us about yourself that students would find surprising or don't know?
Okay. Yeah. Believe it or not, we are real people. So lately I have been really into this game, Stardew Valley. Are you familiar with this at all?
No.
No. Okay. So it's a game for the Nintendo Switch where basically you have a little farm and you're like trying to grow crops and like raise animals, and it's very wholesome. You meet the villagers. But I feel like it's like when I describe it this way, it sounds like the dumbest thing, but it is. I have been literally spending hours on my Stardew Valley farm. That is a fact about me recently.
Yeah, that's pretty relatable.
Yeah.
I'd say.
Did you play video games as a teenager?
No, not really. So my parents didn't let me have a console. I desperately wanted like a Super Nintendo, but I wasn't allowed. I could go to my friends and play, but I wasn't allowed to have one at home. And then we did get a PC, like a computer at home, and I played Wolfenstein 3D on that. I don't know if you remember that one. It's one of the first-person shooters. At the end, you kill Hitler. It's pretty cool.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
This is really interesting. No, I played something called Street Fighter 2.
Oh, yeah, no, Street Fighter 2. That was on the Super NES. Yeah, my friends had it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the arcade, obviously. You could go to the
Exactly.
arcade
I
and play
spent
it.
many wasted hours doing that. But
Nice.
Oh, that's really interesting. Well, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Maybe you can tell our audience what first sparked your interest in psychology and your journey towards becoming a professor.
Yeah, so I became a psych major because I took a class, an intro psych class, and the professor actually, he must be long dead now, so I can say this. He was pretty bad. But the content, I thought, was so interesting. And I thought, if I'm so into the content, despite the fact that I'm obviously not being dazzled by this guy's presentation, then maybe this is the major for me. And so I shopped around a bit. I took a variety of classes, anything from psychology to anthropology to chemistry. And in the end, I was just most interested in the psychology classes.
Was there a potential alternative career you would have considered or had been considering?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I didn't originally plan to go to grad school because I finished undergrad and I just felt so done with school. And so the idea of signing up for more of it just seemed miserable. I was already working at the time doing like kind of a tech job at a startup. This was in the San Francisco Bay Area. So there was a lot of that going on. And this was like 99, 2000. So like tech bubble peak. I had started working there doing support stuff and eventually moved into network and server administration. And so I kept doing that for a couple years post graduating. In another world, might have just kept doing that instead of going back to grad school.
Right. And can you tell us which schools you went to, like the kind of the path?
Yeah. So my undergraduate was UC Berkeley. I grew up in California, in Southern California, and I applied actually to 2 schools total. So to Berkeley and to UC Santa Cruz. Then I took a little bit of time off, like I said, worked, and then I went to grad school at Cornell. So East Coast. Right. Not exactly coastal, but, the Northeast. I was there for 5 years of grad school.
Right. And then how did you end up at U of T?
Yeah. So my first tenure track job was actually overseas at Tilburg in the Netherlands. I was there for 4 years, so from 2010 to 2014. And I wanted to come back to North America. I liked the Netherlands a lot, actually, and I love my colleagues there. In many ways, it was a great place to be. But I missed my friends and family. It's just far. My family is still on the West Coast. So that's a 9-hour time difference, a long flight. And I wanted to be a bit closer. So I had met some of the faculty and grad students from the psychology department here at U of T at a conference in 2012. And so they had an opening and I ended up applying and getting it.
Amazing.
Nice. Yeah. So you gave us a pretty accurate timeline of all your undergrad and grad school. So could you tell us maybe what was like a significant challenge in your graduate degree?
As a graduate student, the biggest challenge is you go from being an undergrad where people give you very clear deadlines and assignments and so on to having a ton of time. And you might be able to relate to this, right? Where you just are kind of on your own and you're supposed to be working on this big picture stuff, but on any given day, nobody's going to come and yell at you if you don't do your work. And so changing from that mentality of I always have a deadline to work to I really have to be self-starting, that was tough.
Yeah, I bet it's a procrastinator's worst nightmare.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So was that a real challenge for you? Did things kind of get prolonged a bit?
Yeah, no, that was tough. And I also, I got a ADHD diagnosis partway through grad school and ended up getting on medication. And that really helped, right? So I think this is actually pretty common. There's many people who might have some ADHD symptoms, but are also high functioning. And as long as the work isn't too demanding, they can manage it. And in undergrad, I managed it. But then grad school, where it was larger scale of work, like writing a paper, it's just such a big project and you're kind of chipping away at it day by day, that the kind of distractibility and the problems with focus really started to harm me. So that definitely helped. And I think I had kind of a combination of the pharmaceutical stuff, but then also kind of behavioral changes that I made to be able to deal with that better. But it was an adjustment period for sure.
Right. Now, reflecting on your time as a student, and then obviously you're teaching undergrads right now, what do you see as the biggest generational difference from when we were students and to what you're seeing today?
They're more anxious. Way more anxious.
Yeah. And what's the most common manifestations of that you see?
They show up worried about their grades a lot, and they get really upset if they don't get the grades that they were hoping to get. I've had people cry in my office. Like, wow. I don't know, John, if that if this is representative of your undergrad experience, but we never cared that much about our grades. Like, it just wasn't really an issue. I don't know. Maybe that's just me.
Yeah. I mean, I cared, especially in the last couple of years, to get into grad school. I definitely think people are more emotionally fragile than I think we were. Yeah, it's one of those things where mental health is not as taboo, but maybe there's like this kind of fine line between over-identifying with some of these conditions or people using anxiety to describe so many different kinds of things that are really just normal parts of life or normal stressors. So yeah, but I definitely have observed that. what's your you're you're a Gen Z.
I've had my fair share of being stressed about grades.
Yeah.
I would agree though that a lot of students like have that at the forefront of their stressors, like grades, but I wonder if that's maybe just a pressure that's been put on them.
I will say,
prevalently.
when I've interviewed other psychology profs, the standards to get into grad school have changed so much that we were reflecting that we wouldn't have gone in with our credentials. A lot of people have already have published papers, and I usually have done that within a 2-year period after undergrad, whereas I got into grad school right through undergrad. I don't think I could do that now. So there's more competition, it seems like, for limited lab positions.
Yep.
Is that the case at U of T?
Yeah, that's certainly true. So that, like, narrowly, I think really is about technology. So we used to need a ton of people to just meet people at the lab, the physical lab, and then sit them down in front of a questionnaire. When I was in grad school, often these were like pencil paper questionnaires, and make sure that they filled it out right and didn't have any questions or whatever. Right. And now we do all of that data collection online. Yep. And the people who do need in-person assistance, they need people who are more highly trained. So they might be doing animal work, they might be doing psychophysiology on humans, but all of that is kind of skilled labor. And so they take a few people and they train them and they keep them. And so if you're just walking in the door saying like, hey, how can I help out? It's hard to find something. I know the Scarborough students really struggle with that because they are told, get research experience, but then it's so competitive to get a spot.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, speaking of research and getting in, let's talk about yours a little bit. So it's really surrounded around politics, right? So would you consider yourself like a politics junkie?
Oh, yeah. I follow it to an unhealthy extent. Absolutely.
Oh, yeah, so a lot.
Yeah,
a
lot.
How much of politics would you say that you typically consume on a daily basis?
Oh, boy, you're really getting me to admit to things I don't like to admit to. I've been making an effort to do less, but I can be on Twitter following politics news for, a couple hours easily in the evenings.
And are there specific channels or like sources that you tend to watch? Are you getting kind of like balanced views from different viewpoints or?
Yeah, so I read the major papers, American papers, plus CBC, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post. And then on social media, I try to follow a wider range of people, including some right-leaning people, although primarily my Twitter follow list is like left of center. And then I also listen to podcasts. I do listen to a podcast from the National Review, which is like a conservative magazine in the States, to get an idea of what they're talking about, right? So I do like to get the conservatives' perspective on stuff sometimes. And I do find that that's a useful complement to what you read in the more left media.
Right. It seems in the past several years, there's been a kind of cultural shift towards conservatism worldwide. Do you see any kind of explanation for this? Are there broader things that are happening, broader trends that you're seeing?
Yeah, so in part, I think it's a post-COVID thing where people are upset at elites in general, and those are identified more with the left typically now. And then you can point also in some other places to kind of specific elite policy failures. Like, so in Europe, they're very upset about immigration and refugees, for example. Now, that was kind of like a bipartisan thing. So in Germany, the person who first owned that was Angela Merkel, who's the head of the center-right party. But because the mainstream parties like really wouldn't touch this stuff, then it became associated with the kind of populist or far-right parties, and I think really empowered them. So I guess you can say generally when people are upset with the establishment now, who's meeting those needs? It's more populist and right-wing parties, and not so much more extreme left-wing parties, with some minor exceptions, like in France, for example. But overall, it's more the right-wing populists who are capitalizing on that unhappiness that people have with how the establishment is handling things. And I think that was really amplified during COVID.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, your research has found that people who are more easily disgusted tend to lean more conservative. Yeah. Can you just talk to us about why this is the case?
Generally, we think that disgust is part of what's called the behavioral immune system, which you can think of this as the germ theory of disease before we had the germ theory of disease, right? So we had this challenge our ancestors did of avoiding stuff that would make you sick. That could be people who have diseases. It could be foods that you eat that might make you ill. All sorts of things that might be dangerous, and they have to somehow learn to avoid them without explicitly knowing, this is what a pathogen is, and here's how you, get COVID from somebody else or whatever, right? We didn't have any of that knowledge. And so we evolved a set of heuristics that kind of meet that goal. So we are repulsed by certain stimuli that can be social, but it can also be non-social stimuli like foods, for example. We don't want them near us. We don't want to touch them. We want to get away from them. And the emotion of disgust is what embodies that in us. So people vary in how easily disgusted they are. If you talk to your friends or family, you might notice that some people are really easily grossed out by a whole range of things. Other people don't really care. So there's kind of innate variability in how sensitive we are to disgust. We call that disgust sensitivity, and that's often measured just by self-report, by asking people about different scenarios, although you can do behavioral measures too. And what we found is that differences in that correlate with people's political outlooks, so that on average, people who are more disgust sensitive are more conservative. So if you think about what a conservative, and specifically a socially conservative ideology is, it's really about restrictiveness and restraint and less experimentation with things where you have social rules. So you have social rules about what to eat in many traditional cultures, about how you should clean yourself, certainly about sex in basically all cultures. And the conservatives are the ones who say we should stick to those rules. Those rules are good ideas. And the more left-leaning people are the ones who say, well, maybe we can reevaluate some of these rules. Maybe some of these rules are just traditions that are passed down, but now have no purpose, and maybe even lead us to make judgments that we don't like or stigmatize people who don't deserve it, and so on. So you can see kind of a continuum there of the people who are like, no, let's stick to the rules, bad to question, to the people who are like, well, let's reevaluate everything, right? Mm-hmm. So in traditional cultures, there's a lot of anthropological evidence that suggests that those cultural traditions actually, in part, avoid pathogen threats. So you learn how to deal with, as a culture in your environment, what are the pathogen threatening things. You learn to avoid or mitigate those threats through those cultural traditions. So it makes sense that the people who are more disgust sensitive, so are more attuned to those sorts of threats, are the ones to whom the cultural traditions would be most attractive. Mm-hmm. And now the debate is about exactly what parts of the kind of cultural conservatism or traditionalism are most important there psychologically. I'm on a paper that found that basically it was the kind of sexual conservatism that did most of the work there. So that really was the link between disgust sensitivity and other conservative attitudes. Other people have found slightly different results there, though. So I would say the jury's still out on exactly what components are important, but I think overall everybody agrees that this is about certain functions that a kind of a socially conservative belief system has, and those being kind of more appealing to people who are more attuned to those pathogen threats.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. When I was an undergrad taking social psychology courses, this terror management theory was this big thing, and I remember a professor telling me about a study where they interviewed people by a cemetery and then in a neutral spot. Yeah. And the people who were interviewed at the cemetery tend to have more conservative views. And there was this kind of like evolutionary psychology explanation. People are primed about their mortality and they become more conservative. Can you talk about this theory? Does it relate to some of the research you're doing, or is it something that's like outdated now?
Yeah. So I think that kind of like similarity a bit is that it posits this kind of fundamental underlying motive that might be motivating people to believe certain things about the world that superficially would seem like completely unrelated. Where it departs, though, is that there really isn't an evolutionary explanation in terror management theory. As far as I understand it, it's based on the work of a sociologist, Ernst Becker, who wrote this book, The Denial of Death. And it's almost like kind of Freudian or psychoanalytic. We have this knowledge that we're going to die. You know that's inevitable, but that also really freaks you out, right? If you really like contemplate that, right? If you touch that hot stove, you're going to be very unhappy. So he says we develop all of these defense mechanisms, and he calls these symbolic immortality mechanisms to avoid having to deal with the fact that we know we're going to die. And so when you prime people, like, so for example, it could be they're walking by a graveyard. It could be you ask them to contemplate what's going to happen to them after they die. They reach for these defense mechanisms. And one of these defense mechanisms, these worldview defenses, was supposed to be that you bolster the positivity of your in-group, your nation, whatever. So that might be you become more patriotic, you become more conservative. So it's really a beautiful theory. It is just so cool. It makes so many fun, interesting predictions. When I was in grad school, this was all the rage. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like the empirical evidence for this is that great. There were a ton of studies published, certainly, but many of them were with small samples. And in an era where psychologists were doing a lot of selective publication, a lot of what's called p-hacking, which is just kind of massaging analyses to get the result you want. And when people have done bigger, pre-registered, pre-planned replications, trying to reproduce some of these key effects from that literature, they've failed to do so. So right now, I'm pretty skeptical of that body of work on an empirical basis.
Right. Interesting. As we're on the topic of conservatism and disgust, we have a slideshow of some popularly voted things that are really disgusting to people, and we just want to have your opinion on them and maybe why people tend to be most disgusted about these things. All right. So first we have feet. We'll go through all of them. Maybe you can tell us a little bit. And we have garbage.
Yeah.
Pimple popping.
Yeah.
Hair and food. Bugs.
Yep.
And a really specific one, but a rat in a toilet.
Rat in a
coming out of a toilet. Right.
Yeah. This is great. Okay. Yeah, so a lot of these are about animals that might carry pathogens, like rats, for example. They carried the plague, we now know. People at the time, I don't think, had a great idea of exactly what the route of transmission was, but we do seem to have evolved an aversion to particularly animals that pose pathogen risks to us. So that could be stuff like maggots, that could be stuff like rats. Obviously, this is not based on a scientific theory or a true understanding. So you should expect that these things would sometimes go wrong, right? That we would be disgusted by things like spiders, which don't really, can't really get us sick, but they're close enough to other kind of bugs that they trigger that same disgust response. Then we have some food related stimuli. So generally people are kind of more disgust sensitive around anything that you eat. So something that's not supposed to be in the thing that you eat is typically disgusting, right? Even when, like hair, I'm actually fascinated by the idea that people are so disgusted by hairs, because I think I could eat somebody else's hair and not really suffer any ill consequences, but it comes off of their body, right? And in general, we're kind of like not fans of body products. So the pimple popping certainly has that aspect to it as well, right? Feet, I don't have a great explanation for feet right now. Maybe it's just that they kind of smell bad. Yeah. Feet I would have to consider further. I will say the photo that you showed me had a really gross looking toenail, right?
Yeah.
So that, I mean, it's a little bit deck stacking there.
Right.
But if you think about how this stuff evolved, what is kind of a visible indication that somebody might be sick or might have parasites is that there's some sort of visual abnormality, right? And so it might be that whatever's wrong with that person's toenail totally is not contagious. The heuristic is triggered by kind of visual abnormalities.
Right.
Is there any evidence that younger generations are setting the bar lower for things that disgust them? For example, have you ever heard of the term an ick?
Oh, yeah, getting the ick. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Is there any evidence for that people are generally finding things more and more disgusting and the bar is like lower and lower?
That's a great question. I have not looked at this recently, so I'm not sure. We would very reliably find gender effects, such that women at least say that they're more disgusted, but we typically would not find age effects. But this was done a while ago, so I did these studies like mostly in grad school. So if you're talking about something like Gen Z, we wouldn't have been able to pick that up yet.
Right. What gives you an ick though? Like what? Can you tell
give
us
an
like
example? Could be something with students even.
Yeah. So I'm generally not super disgust sensitive, so it's pretty limited. Oof.
I feel like you have something to say.
No, I'm just thinking about like one time I went on a date with this woman and we got like pizza and she had this like piece of tomato stuck on her teeth. And it was so, and I just should have said something, right? But it was so embarrassing. And so I basically solved the problem by like not looking at her directly.
Right.
And then later she was like, I just don't feel like there was a connection. I noticed that you didn't look at me at all.
And was that like ruminating in your brain? Like you kept thinking about the tomato during the date?
I don't know. It just like weirded me out. Like,
Oh my God.
yeah, I know. The poor woman. I feel bad. I just should have said something. It's just the moment to do it is immediately. You can't be like 10 minutes ago, right? Because it would have been, she had stopped eating the pizza. It would have been super obvious that this was like, I had been dealing with this for the last like 50 minutes. So yeah, I just didn't say anything.
Funny.
Yeah.
Doctor,
It's
do you
like,
have an
did you ever see the Seinfeld episode with the man hands?
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Seinfeld is basically every episode is about the ick in different ways.
That's true. That's true.
Do you have a specific ick?
I guess I have an ick. Like, I guess if I'm thinking of Gen Z, like constantly on their filming everything,
But you're always
even
on
their
TikTok.
emotional breakdowns, they're filming their emotional breakdowns.
But you're always on TikTok.
Yeah, well, I guess. Yeah. Or I guess like this didn't happen to me, but someone told me that someone was cutting their toenails on the airplane. Like.
Oh, okay. Now that's just unacceptable. Yeah.
How about you? Do you have any icks?
I was actually
Or Gen X icks?
No, I think I have this really big issue with people singing in public.
Oh.
If someone just starts singing, and I'm the problem. That people are the problem when we don't like listening to people showcasing a talent because then they'll be scared to. But I don't know. I just can't handle it. I don't know why.
Huh. Does it matter whether they're singing well or poorly?
No. You know what? If it's in a controlled setting where they should be performing, like a concert or a talent show, like that's different. It's like more in public, like when people are on the street singing. Like, I don't know. What's your theory?
I don't have one. That's a great ick though, because I feel like an ick properly should be something that seems like totally trivial and like it shouldn't bother you, right?
Yes.
So like,
Yeah.
like the toenail cutting, anybody's going to be grossed out by it. This is the great example from the show that I like that's on Netflix. Nobody Wanted This. She gets the ick because her boyfriend brings a bouquet of flowers to her mom that's too large.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I just like
Yes.
just saw him holding that giant bouquet, and I was like, such an ick. Yeah.
Moving ahead, is there an area of research right now that you're really excited about currently?
Yeah. So right now in the lab, my grad student Eloise Cote and I are working on some natural language processing stuff where we have collected a ton of Twitter data back when Twitter still allowed academic access. So basically what we did is we got every tweet posted by a member of the US Congress, so the House and Senate, from the years 2016 to 2023. So this is millions of tweets. And then we can use basically computer algorithms to tell us what are people talking about. So we can say what sort of moral language are they using? What kind of topics are they discussing? What topics get most moralized or not? We can look at differences between the left and the right because we know, which party the legislator belongs to. We can look at partisan extremity because we have measures of that. We can look at stuff like retweets. We have those metadata as well. So it's a really rich data set that we've published couple papers on and that we're kind of continuing to work on now.
Interesting.
Yeah, maybe we can take a little matcha break.
Yeah.
And a sip here.
Sounds great.
Dr. Inbar, as I mentioned before we started the podcast, we had members of our team come up with some questions, video questions, so we can go there.
Hi, Dr. Inbar. My name is Adriana. I'm a third-year undergraduate psychology student at the University of Guelph. And my question for you is, why is it so difficult for people to change their beliefs, even when they face opposing evidence?
So I think for the types of beliefs that she's asking about, that I take her to be asking about, these aren't just beliefs about neutral topics. So for example, if I'm like, I think that Everest is X meters high, and you're like, actually, Wikipedia says Y meters. And I'm like, okay, right? You don't resist changing your beliefs in that sort of a situation. But for beliefs that have to do with your kind of core values or social group memberships, those beliefs don't exist in a vacuum. So if I suddenly start believing, for example, that mRNA vaccines are bad for you, and I go around and start telling people that, I'm going to get unpleasant pushback from people that I know and respect. There might be real consequences for me in terms of my social group memberships. Now, I mean, to be clear, I think my belief that those vaccines are an amazing invention is the right one, right? But like just supposing that I had started to doubt that, I think there would be a real psychological reluctance to engage with that evidence because I would realize that it would be really costly, socially costly for me to change my views. And often I think people don't even need literally the kind of negative social feedback. They just imagine, here's how my friends and colleagues and family would react if I decided that I had such and such view.
Hi, Dr. Inbar. My name is Marcella, and I'm a third-year psychology student attending Wilfrid Laurier. And I was just wondering, when should I trust my gut and when should I not?
So people talk about intuitive judgments as being judgments where you have an answer and you don't know how you got there. So you might imagine meeting somebody and thinking, oh, this person just seems like a really great person, or else, I'm really kind of getting the ick a little bit. And you might not be able to say exactly why that is. So there are some cases in which people kind of have repeated exposure to information and they can develop these sorts of intuitions or instincts that are on average accurate. So if you think about people who spend a lot of time playing chess, they can just look at a chess position and they have a feeling for what a good move is, or at least for what moves can be ruled out. And so I think if you know that you are in that sort of situation, you've gotten a lot of information by doing some sort of task repeatedly, and you also don't have time to examine every possibility, then I think relying on your intuition can be a good strategy, at least for saying, okay, here are the things that I'm going to examine more closely.
Hi, Dr. Inbar. It's Rain here. I took your judgment and decision-making class last semester. Even then, I sometimes struggled with comparing myself to other students who seem to have everything figured out. My question for you is, how can I make decisions based on what's right for me rather than feeling pressured by other people's successes? Thank you, and I hope you're having a good time on our podcast.
That's nice. Well, great to see you, Rain. So I feel like this is something that I actually have gotten a little bit better with over time. So I think the first thing to realize is that your default is going to be social comparison, unless you're like one of these very lucky superhuman people who just doesn't care what other people think. It's not, that doesn't describe most of us, right? So your default is going to be to think like, oh, that person's so much better than me at this. And like, why can't I be as good or whatever? And what I realized eventually is that no matter how successful you are, there's always somebody else that you can compare yourself to who looks better than you. So it literally never stops. And I think when we do it thinking, well, once I succeed enough, this is going to go away and this is just going to motivate me to want to work harder or something like that. And it turns out that's not true. Like you just do this forever unless you make a decision not to do it. And I wouldn't say that I'm perfect at it, but having that kind of in the back of my head has allowed me to just be happy for other people when they do well and to kind of work on what I think my standards are for myself, right? So not by comparison to other people, but like, what do I think is important for me to do and just try and live up to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I often struggle with that too, but I usually try and take other people's successes as like an inspiration instead of a competition.
Yeah, that's a good reframing because it's not zero sum, right? They're not taking something away from you.
Exactly. Okay.
All right.
Can move on.
Hi, Dr. Inbar. My name is Nikta Pruden, and I'm a third-year psychology student at the University of Toronto. With the federal elections approaching, my social media is flooded with the same opinions. When it comes time to decide, how will I know if the decision was truly mine?
So like, I'm going to read this a little bit about like, should you worry if you're not exposing yourself to views from people that you disagree with politically? And I think, yeah, I think you should. So media have gaps, and that's that's true both on the left and the right. The kind of center-left media leaves certain things out. The right-wing media certainly has their areas of focus. And I think I don't think it's psychologically possible to be like, I'm going to go like full on listening to the media from the side that I like don't belong to or disagree with. But dipping your toe in a little bit, I think is really useful. So finding like one or two sources, people that don't make you want to punch a hole in the wall, but that do have views that you disagree with somewhat, and seek those out and listen to them and see if there's anything there. And often I find that like when I listen to that stuff, it really prompts me to think and to counter argue typically. I mean, I'm not usually agreeing. I mean, that's why I'm seeking them out, is because there are people I disagree with, but I feel like it makes me have a better understanding of like why I believe what I do or why I support the policies that I support.
Switching gears a little bit, going into the admission process of going into grad school, if you could maybe tell us how it works and what happens behind the scenes when you're choosing students.
Yeah, for sure. So as a faculty member, we get a file of basically every applicant, and that has everything that they submitted to us. So that would be their transcript, their letters, their statement of interest. So we get every file and then a list of who wrote us down specifically. And then so typically what I do is I go through the people who listed me and I look for kind of a fit in interest, and I look at the transcript. So basically there, to start with, I'm looking at the personal statement and I'm looking at their undergraduate grades and what courses they took.
Mm-hmm. And what makes a personal statement stand out to you?
Yeah, this is a bit of an intuitive judgment, to be honest. So you read a ton of these. And so if somebody writes about something unusual, and particularly something unusual that has to do with something that I'm interested in, so like specifically mentioning the kind of research that the lab is interested in and giving like a genuine and compelling kind of story about how they got interested in that topic, that would grab my attention. That said, I don't rely on personal statements that much.
Okay. So what is, I guess, of greater weight to you in terms of making these decisions?
Yeah, undergrad GPA. And then if I can get other like samples of their work, like if I can get a writing sample, if they did an undergrad thesis, or if they've worked closely with a faculty member that I know, and that person can tell me about them.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. The reference letters, like how important are they? And also, are they kind of generic in some sense? Like, how do you distinguish one that's really like indicates that the student is a standout student?
Yeah, they're pretty low signal, to be honest, because typically they're so glowing.
Yeah.
And then like the variability, unless I know the writer well, like let's say that they'll basically never say anything negative. So let's say I get the feeling that like it's a little less glowing. Okay, is it because of student characteristics, or is it because that writer just tends to write letters that are slightly more tepid? I have no way of knowing that. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of scan them for obvious red flags. And then I would weight more heavily a letter from somebody that I knew personally, and I probably would follow up with that person as well if I were seriously considering the student. But beyond that, I don't really care that much about the letters.
Right. I mean, I think in some of the research we've done about your opinions, you've kind of been a critic of the whole grad school admission process, the interview process, and not being entirely convincing. Can you just comment on that?
Yeah, I think we do a lot of things that at best add noise and at worst add bias, particularly bias against people who don't know the quote unquote hidden curriculum, which is a term that you might have heard. So yeah, interviews, we know from research that unstructured interviews do not tell you anything useful about the job candidate. And instead, they encourage you to focus on things that are biasing. Like, do they seem outgoing, for example, right? Do they seem personable? Are they attractive? Like all of these things that are not relevant to their kind of success in the role in an unstructured interview kind of heuristically dominate your perceptions of them. I've tried to make this argument that we should not be caring about them as much as we do. And to some degree that's been successful, but we still do them because people are just really uncomfortable with the idea of extending an offer to a student without interviewing them. Now, I think you could make a case for them that you want to screen out people who have like really obvious social impairments, but that's a pretty rare situation. Like somebody who's so socially impaired, they can't keep it together for like a half-hour interview.
We interviewed some clinical psychology professors, and they were saying the interpersonal skill of the student has such weight because they're imagining them spending the next 4 or 5 years with this person. And what we're hearing from you is that that could introduce a ton of bias.
Yes.
Right?
So, yeah, what I would say to that is, how do you know? How do you know that your impression of the person's interpersonal skill in the interview is actually predictive of their eventual abilities?
So there's that equal uncertainty whether you do a structured or an unstructured interview, you're saying?
So a structured interview tends to do better. The problem is it's actually kind of hard to do a structured interview for the sort of stuff that we care about, which is just so amorphous, right? Would this person be a good researcher? Is this person going to be an empathetic clinician? Those are really tough to get at. Now, I don't think it's impossible, but currently we're just not even putting in the work to think about what would a structured interview look like and how would we be confident that our assessments based on that interview are actually predictive of the stuff that we care about.
Right. Mm-hmm. So to the grad students who the ones are shining, you say, and are really well resonate with you and your research, how many of those grad students would you say go on to be a professor or chosen to be a professor?
Yeah. So, I have a very small sample coming through my lab. I would say at U of T, it's probably in the social personality area where I know the outcomes best. We are probably putting about half or maybe a bit more of our students into academic track jobs. So that could be a postdoc, that could be straight to an assistant professor job. Those sort of vary. Some go to more teaching focused places, some go to more research focused places. The quantitative, the research design skills, the data analytics skills, those are valuable in all sorts of different areas.
Mm-hmm. Just switching gears here, can you tell us about your podcast, how it started, what inspired you to start it, and was it difficult to kind of get it going? Were there any ups and downs in the beginning?
Yeah, so it was me and Mickey Inslicht, my colleague at UT Scarborough, who started the podcast. And the way it originated is we would go and get drinks and we would sit outside on a terrace and drink beers and we would talk about what's going on in the field and have you read this paper? And eventually I think Mickey was like, wouldn't it be fun if we just recorded this? These are cool conversations and maybe somebody else would like them. As far as challenges, I think the main challenges were technical. Just if you listen to the audio from some of those early episodes, it's just a disaster. There was a lot of learning by trial and error. Neither of us are, audio engineers. So it was quite a bit of work figuring out how to get things to sound.
Yeah. In a 2018 podcast, there was a bit of a controversy when you suggested that diversity statements may not effectively achieve diversity goals and might just serve as symbolic gestures. So can you just elaborate on what happened in that instance? And I'm just curious on a personal level, how it felt when all of that kind of played out.
Yeah. So, right. Like you said, this episode is pretty old. At the time, I think the University of California was starting to roll these out system-wide. So the idea is if you're hiring faculty, you want them to write a statement about their contributions to diversity and what they've done, what they would do in the future, what their views are, et cetera. And we were kind of talking about some of the pros and cons of these sorts of statements, including ways in which they might not help achieve the goals that they're purported to achieve. So we're kind of taking a critical look at them. Yep. Certainly not saying there's no value here at all, but saying what are some of the pros and cons. And then years later, my partner got a job offer at UCLA and they were evaluating me for a partner hire. So this is something that's sometimes done in academia. If you want to recruit somebody, you also hire their partner if their partner is an academic as well. Mm-hmm. So it happened that they had a need in the social personality area, which is my area. And so I went out there and interviewed and thought that the interview went quite well. And then heard afterwards that the way that it was put to me was that some of the grad students are upset. And somebody forwarded me a letter that they had written that said, basically, we can't hire this guy because of his objectionable political views, including this stuff about diversity statements. And they had gone through the podcast episodes and focused on that. I will note that the UC system just abolished diversity statements last week. It was sort of peak of this stuff in some environments in the US where you really could get canceled for having a view that I think most normal people would be like, what is wrong with that. It does seem, in retrospect, kind of crazy. But some parts of US academia are just like hyper progressive, and they don't like people asking questions. It signals that you're not on board, that you're on the wrong team, and they don't want that.
And when you got that feedback, can you tell us like what that was like for you? Did you feel like there was like a real unfair characterization of who you were?
Yeah, I mean, I did. I felt upset and angry, and I felt like this was characterizing me as a threat to the well-being of the graduate students, which in my opinion was ridiculous. And it's funny, like this stuff is like really turned on a dime in the US, but at the time, it wasn't that crazy that you might be denied a job for some view that, you know, is quite like mainstream and innocuous. People had gotten fired for less within this kind of progressive ecosystem. So that's always the key asterisk, is like, this is in places where you have just this high concentration of left-leaning people and they all agree on what's right. And if you don't agree with them, then they don't want anything to do with you.
All right. Well, speaking about students having an opinion on profs,
oh boy.
RateMyProf is a pretty popular site that we use. I use it, honestly, to pick my courses sometimes. So you have a pretty good rating, 4.1 out of 5. I don't know the last time you've checked. Do you usually read your reviews?
I glance at them occasionally. The issue is that there's self-selection there, right? So you get some people who are obviously mad, and then you get some people who had a really great time. And so it's like bimodal in that way. But I don't think that they're completely useless either, because you do get like a feeling for what the class is going to be like, or what some parts of it might be that you might like or not.
I recently read in the paper that there's a professor from Columbia that wanted to leave to go to U of T because of Columbia's response to the threat of removing funding based on certain policies. They have political positions that they're not taking action against certain political protests. Do you have any thoughts on that? Is politics like playing too much of a role in academia?
Boy, that is a broad question. I think that we can't help but be somewhat involved in politics because we depend on the government for funding. And that's true directly in the case of Canadian universities, which are almost all public, and in the case in the US, in the case of state schools, which again, they're public institutions, but also private schools cannot survive without government funding, right? Research funding, student loans, et cetera. So to some extent, the government is going to want to have a say in how that money is spent and how those institutions are run. So I think there is part of academia that's inherently political, in that the big picture structuring of what are we teaching, what are we trying to accomplish, that is something that the public is rightfully going to have some say in, because they write some of the checks. I would distinguish that from research questions, where I think we really want researchers, and I think also teachers, to be free from political interference. So the idea that a government might come and say, we gave you this grant, but now we've decided we don't like your topic. Grant canceled, goodbye, right? The idea that the government might come and intervene and say, we don't like how you're talking about sensitive topic X. We don't like how you're talking about racism. You're fired or your class is canceled. Like, no, I don't think that sort of micromanaging is ever helpful. And I think it's often quite destructive. I think those things do get conflated, right? So, and also I think because this is a politically polarized question, people go to one of two extremes, like either you got to beat the woke faculty until they stop indoctrinating students. And on the other side, it's like, you know, hands off our universities. And I don't think either of those is right? You can't take so much public money and say, well, we're going to do absolutely whatever we want. Right. But at the same time, micromanaging is just, to me, a terrible idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know when I was in grad school, there was one camp that would say, like, you got to let the data speak for itself. And then another camp that behind the scenes would say, if the data says something that we don't like, we're going to hesitate to publish it, or we're going to try and take a different angle. And the politics of it all seemed to color everything that they were doing. Should psychology be value-free and just let the data speak for itself?
I don't know that you could ever be value-free, but I think that you can adopt some set of values that you try to adhere to. And of course, like, you're going to be imperfect in that. There's going to be failures. But I think there's one kind of broad way of looking at what we're doing that says we are doing this work in service of some other social goal. And we ought to be publishing things that support that social goal. And if the findings don't support that goal, then don't publish them. I think that's bad. Yeah. I think that we ought to have an orientation that says what we are trying to do first and foremost is to discover what's true. And that if we find something that's true, but that's disagreeable to us ideologically or politically, it's incumbent on us to treat that like any other finding.
Well, at Enriched Mindset, we're really interested in financial psychology, and we're just curious what you think is the relationship between money and happiness.
Yeah. So more money makes you happier. And that increases basically as far up on the income distribution as people have been able to look. So like even among millionaires, people who are richer are happier than people who are less rich, but you get diminishing returns. So the relationship kind of tails off. So it looks like kind of a curve that's steep at first and then gets shallower and shallower and shallower. And you might think about, well, is it really worth the diminishing returns at the top end? Or maybe should I focus on something else? But yeah, sorry to be the bearer of bad news there, because I think it would be nice. I would love to say, yeah, it doesn't make you happier. But no, it totally does. That's what the research shows, both within countries, across countries, basically like most ways that you slice it. It's better to have more money than less.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you think money has been a big influence on your decisions, like academically and within your career?
Oh, no, not whatsoever.
Okay. Why not?
Well, I guess I don't have particularly like fancy tastes. I'm just lucky that way. I have a few key things where I really like to spend money on stuff, but for the most part, my tastes aren't super expensive. And I've been lucky that I've just gotten jobs that have paid reasonably well. So I haven't really had to worry about it. I mean, I'm sure I would care more about money if I were struggling more financially, right? But I've just been kind of fortunate to be fine as long as I don't want to do super expensive stuff.
Right.
Well, in academia, salaries can vary quite significantly depending on what position you have, what institution you go to. Are you able to share with us your own experience with income ranges and what people can expect if they're interested in becoming a professor or work at a university in psychology in Canada or in the States, and you also worked overseas? Like, what are the things that the salary ranges people can expect?
So it varies pretty widely. So where I started at Tilburg, they didn't pay particularly well. I think it was like 55,000 euros or something like that a year, which the euro was doing better then, but still it's not a huge amount of money. They're generally kind of flatter with their income distribution. That's not just in academia, just in the Netherlands in general. So, we made more than the grad students, but not that much more, right? The grad students were already making like pretty decent money. And then I came to Canada, and I don't know how much we would pay to start here, but I would imagine it would be over 100K. So it's really very decent money, even in an expensive city like Toronto. And then you get regular raises and stuff. We have a pretty good, it's not quite a union, it's a faculty association, but it's like a quasi-union. And they do pretty well at getting the university to give us raises. In the US, it super varies. So there are private schools where you would definitely start in the like six figures in USD. And then there are smaller state schools where you might be making 40,000, 50,000, and that would be like a tenure track job. God help you if you're adjuncting. I mean, you'd do better working at McDonald's, honestly. So yeah, it's highly unequal, especially in the US.
Wow. If you could go back to any moment throughout your academic journey, what would be a piece of advice you'd tell yourself, and at what point in that journey would you pick?
Yeah. Okay. So, well, I'll give you two answers because I feel like one is kind of cheating. So the cheating one is that when I was in graduate school, this was like pre what I'm going to call like methods revolution in social personality psych. So that means like a lot of small studies, a lot of p-hacking, and like a lack of awareness of like what p-hacking even was. And in like 2010, 2012, like the field as a whole discovered that that stuff was really bad. And I was kind of very early on sold that that was really bad. So I would have liked to have known that earlier, and I would have liked to have been more skeptical about research that is actually untrustworthy earlier. Like if I look at some of my early notes from grad school, I'm just like uncritically accepting things that are now in retrospect like obviously ridiculous.
Really?
Oh yeah, totally. Like I found a notebook from like the first conference I went to, SPSP, Society for Personality and Social Psychology. That's it. Yeah. And I was writing down these findings, you know, stuff that I thought was interesting to follow up on. And they're sorry, I almost swore. They're insane. They're just completely insane. And I just like, I obviously took them 100% seriously at face value. It's like, no, absolutely not. Okay. So that one is sort of, I mean, it's very specific. And I don't know if it's that useful to anybody now. I'd say like the more useful thing is like getting used to this feeling of incompetence that used to be really scary when I try to do something new. So like start on a new research area, learn a new method, really anything where I'm not already competent. At first, I'm like, this is impossible. I'm such an idiot. None of this makes any sense. And then eventually you go through that enough times and you're like, oh no, that's just the process, right? Like, or at least it's just the process for me. I'm sure there's people who are smarter than I am who sit down and are like, boom, got it. But for me, it takes a while. And like learning to be okay with that process and knowing that like, you know, because it feels negative, that like negative feeling is okay because it's part of like getting better at something. I wish I had kind of realized that earlier because I think at first it was very daunting for me.
Yeah. It's really interesting you talk about p-hacking because a social psychology prof I had just started talking to me about how people just like run a study. It doesn't, most of the time it doesn't work. They just keep messing with it until it finally works and then they publish it.
Yeah.
And you can find a study that finds one effect. And if you look hard enough, you'll find something that says the exact opposite. So it's really interesting that this has come out, I guess, about a decade ago. But I am finding, because I haven't been in academia for a long time, that a lot of the things that I learned are now completely outdated or false.
Yeah.
So it's quite a revelation. I know that's something that I think psychology struggles with in terms of comparing itself to other sciences. It sometimes feels like it's not building on the shoulders of previous scientists. It's kind of like working on trends, but I'm hoping that changes.
Oh yeah, I'm currently in a second year statistics class, and we've already learned about p-hacking, harking, all those things in open science frameworks. So honestly, it has changed, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's something that you now get in your methods classes.
Yeah.
That's great. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Because we were taught, if anything, exactly the opposite. So there's this famous article by this guy, Daryl Bem, about how you should analyze data. And it's basically like, go poke around in there, try a bunch of different analyses, try a bunch of different exclusions, right?
I've seen that.
Yeah, you've seen that article, right? Yeah, and it's kind of legendary because it's like you read this and you're like, oh my God, this is like a list of things not to do.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I guess like if you had to give high school students some advice, if they're interested in studying psychology, what would that be? And is it something that's really worthwhile in terms of studying and building a career around?
Yeah, so I do think it's a worthwhile major. I mean, certainly if you want to be a clinician, which many of our undergraduates do, that's the route to that. But also if you don't, I think it's quite a flexible major. So you could go to grad school, but you could also not go to grad school and do lots of things in marketing, HR, all sorts of other stuff. I think works well with a psychology degree. I guess as far as should you do this, I do think that one thing maybe students don't anticipate is that we are getting kind of more technical as a discipline. And I don't think that students always realize that. So for example, the undergraduate curriculum at my university more and more includes programming using statistical software like R, for example, where you're writing scripts, and kind of a quantitative and technical focus that I think students sometimes don't expect coming in. Yeah. And I think knowing that that's going to be part of your experience as an undergraduate is useful, because if you're like, I just 100% am allergic to that stuff and don't ever want to do it, yeah, maybe that's not the major for you, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very true. Well, I mean, to end things off, for our listeners who are really interested in politics, judgment, morality, where can they find your work or your current research?
Yeah, so my website always has my most recent papers, so they can look there. It's just yoelinbar.net, or you can Google my name. And sometimes I talk about my research on my podcast, so you can check that out as well.
Amazing. So we just want to thank you so much for your openness and for engaging with us. This was an amazing conversation. So we really appreciate it. Hopefully you enjoyed your matcha.
It was delicious. Thank you very much. And
maybe we can have another sip. Another cheers.
Yeah, cheers. Last sip. And this was a great time. And thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much. And to our listeners, make sure you stay tuned to our next episode of the Enriched Mindset Podcast.